And welcome to you all, both here and those of you watching online. I'm Mike Kenny, definitely an unroving Mike, and I'm director, or one of the directors of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, and I'll chair this first panel discussion. The theme of the panel is, as Dennis says, to explore the question of what a focus on place brings to our understanding of the different life chances, or sometimes called outcomes, for different groups of people, and what does that mean for public policy? And this has been a theme that we've been interested in since we launched several years ago. We began, one of our core programs then was indeed on place and public policy, and we developed quite a wide-ranging program of research on that theme, which I've been very proud to lead. I won't give you all the ins and outs of everything we've done, but just to summarize some of the work, I mean, some of it led by my colleague Diane Coyle, focusing very much on the regional economy and issues of regional productivity, and you'll hear more about that later. Some of it that I've been more directly engaged with, looking at how inequalities play out in Britain's towns, the issues around devolution and at what level decision-making and policy ought to be developed in the context of place, and the question of the importance of community level infrastructure and whether it's why my government might need to spend resource and effort in rebuilding that. So those are issues that we've worked on, and the work in that area continues. I mean, just to step back and think about place as a concept, as a theme in public policy, it's been around for some while as a notion, and it obviously has a long prehistory in things like regional policy and urban regeneration and other sort of spatially focused policies that different governments have attempted. But I think the really interesting thing that I want us to get into today is, what does a place-focused approach to policy bring with it that is different, potentially, or not, from those other earlier iterations of spatial policy? How should we define it? It still seems to me the definition of place-based policy is still quite elusive. What does it actually mean in terms of quite crunchy things like how governments make decisions, what priorities get set, where decisions are best made, and what kinds of engagement governments ought to have with the communities and people who live in different places. And now, quite recently here in the UK, we've had the publication of a major, as a landmark document really, in relation to this idea of place-based policy, which is the Levelling Up white paper, which I'm sure we'll be talking about. And that gives us, I think, a nice point of reference for this discussion, but it's a reference only. I want us to range more widely to think about some of these questions about place, and also to think about examples, lessons from other countries, as well, I think very importantly, about examples of placemaking, to use that phrase, locally, so beneath the level of state level government. So to explore these issues and more, we have a great set of panelists, and I'm just going to introduce them to you. I'll do that in the order in which they're going to speak, even though it's not quite the order that they're sitting. A late addition to the panel, but a great addition to the panel, is Josh Bailey, over here on the far left. Josh is Senior Policy Advisor from the Levelling Up Task Force that produced the Levelling Up white paper earlier this year. And before that, he's held a number of roles in the Cabinet Office and indeed the Treasury, and has worked across domestic and international policy within British government. He was one of the key authors of the white paper. I'm not going to ask him which bits he wrote, but also I can announce, I think I'm okay to announce this publicly, sort of breaking news, is that Josh is going to be working with us at the Bennett Institute on a project on the history of regional policy making. This, I should say, is outside his civil service role. He's going to be doing some part-time work with us, and we're absolutely delighted to have him in our midst thinking about these issues. So welcome to him. To my immediate left is Professor Francesca Gaines. Francesca is Chair of Public Policy at Manchester University. She's Academic Co-Director of Policy at Manchester, which a number of you all know is a very, very impressive public engagement vehicle, and she's a Fellow of the UK's Academy of Social Sciences. She has wide-ranging expertise in public policy and governance, and particular interests in inequalities policies, And I know she's currently a member of the Greater Manchester Women and Girls Equality Panel. And then last but definitely not least, sitting in the I was going to say in the middle, but you're not quite in the middle over here, we have Dame Fiona Reynolds. Fiona has a number of hats really that are relevant to this conversation. She's chair of the Governing Council of the Royal Agricultural University. She's also chair of the National Audit Office since 2021. And just as we were chatting beforehand, nicely revealed that, of course, they'll be auditing the Levelling Up white paper. So that's going to be an interesting exercise. We can see how that starts to go. And she's, of course, a well-known figure here in Cambridge from her time as a Master of Emmanuel College. She's also, I should say, the chair of the Bennett Institute Management Board. So in a sense, is our boss. So we are definitely on our best behaviour. She's had a long career in the voluntary public sectors, including as Director General of the National Trust. And she was, prior to that, Director of the Women's Unit in the Cabinet Office. So those are our speakers. How the session will run is like this. Each of them are going to speak quite briefly, just for 3 to 5 minutes maximum, just to give some early thoughts on this broad question about place, opportunity and policy. Then I'll follow with a question or two to each of them, and we'll have a shared conversation here. After that, there'll be an opportunity to have questions from the audience, both you here, but also those watching online, if all goes smoothly with our technology, which I'm sure it will. So enough from me. Let me hand over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Mike. So as all you know, my name is Andy Haldane. I'm the former chief economist. To the student in the audience, you'll notice I'm not Andy Haldane. He obviously sends his apologies. I'm some sort of pale, literally in some respects, imitation. And I'll try and sort of channel my inner Haldane through the course of this morning. I thought, as Mike said, I'd sort of start by saying a few things about how we thought about place in the context of the white paper. Obviously, the white paper is a part of this conversation, but as Mike has said, it's only a component. And I think, this morning we're going to have a slightly wider discussion about place and how it interacts with policy. But starting with the white paper, I think it is worth reiterating that the white paper itself, is a very ambitious initiative in the sense that it is trying to reconfigure how the UK thinks about growth policy more generally through a spatial lens. And that really isn't something which has been done before in the UK. As Mike has said, there is a sort of long and obviously very storied history of how regional and spatial policy has operated in the UK. But one of the sort of continuities in that history is that it has been a discrete area of policy. There are things that we have called spatial policy, which are separate from other kinds of policy. The sort of big conceptual shift that the white paper is trying to sort of orchestrate is a move away from that idea that there is something which is siloed and separate, called regional spatial policy, into something which is just policy, and to re-engineer how all policy is done at all tiers to make it more place sensitive and aware of where it is operating. And that core insight, I think, then informs everything that we try to do through that, and hopefully will inform everything that we do from here. It also represented an attempt to try and grapple with the years of accumulated wisdom, many of whom in this room have sort of contributed to that debate, and try and synthesize that, which I can tell you was not challenging. Was challenging rather. Was not challenging. First of all, it involved reading a lot of papers, but that synthesis process obviously meant that we had to confront a series of tensions and challenges that there are in place-based policy. And I think it's worth drawing out a few of those, and I'm sure we'll get into a longer discussion about these as we progress through. Firstly is about the kind of core debate about people versus place. And I think we sort of tried to synthesize that and find a place where we felt there was a sort of comfortable representation of what the analysis tells us and what that should mean for policy. Secondly is, if you are going to work across different spatial tiers, and I think it's just a reality of the UK's economic and political geography that is what you have to do if you're going to do place-based policy, how are you going to resolve the coordination problems across those different spatial tiers? The UK is obviously grappling with its sort of own institutional history around that, and that institutional history is sticky, and the white paper tries to sort of point us in a direction which can try and rationalise that system of coordination into something which can endure and produce more coherent policy. It also tries to sort of think very deeply about what the growth framework for the UK going forward will be. And in that sense, it points us in a direction where the growth framework has to be one that explicitly sees growth occurring in all places. There obviously will be varying degrees of priority in places as to where you think there is greater potential or where you might try and focus your efforts. But it fundamentally says that growth can only be achieved if it is achieved through all places. And I think in that sense, we should have tried to take quite a definitive position on that. It's not the position of the white paper that we can continue with a growth model which is as lopsided as our current growth model is, or even one which is only slightly modified at the margins. We need something which is quite significantly different from the current growth model that we have. And that's because, not least because of the fourth sort of tension that we try to address, which is how place sits amongst the other structural challenges that the UK will face going forward, both domestically and internationally. So in many ways, there are obviously myriad good reasons why you would want a much more sensitive, place-sensitive growth framework. But we also think you need a place-sensitive growth framework because that is the only way that we're also going to be able to reconcile it with the other structural challenges that we face, the post-pandemic economy that has to be rebuilt now, but also crucially the longer term, much more deeply ingrained structural challenges, the transition to climate change, transition to net zero, dealing with an aging society, global migration forces, also a more contested geopolitical environment as well. And in that sense, it increasingly becomes sort of bigger and bigger picture. A place-based policy has to be one which is both sensitive towards, the granular, what the specific needs of individual places are, but also the very global picture now, because ultimately all of these spatial tiers, domestically and internationally, are collapsing. And the white paper tries to sort of begin to paint a course that points you to a better, sort of more prosperous and inclusive version of that growth. I'll briefly say something about sort of where we think we need to go next now. I think first and foremost, there is obviously a significant delivery challenge that we now face. The white paper, as lots of people have sort of very nicely said, is ambitious, but now needs to be backed up with delivery. That means a few things in the first instance. Firstly, we need to sort of implement this kind of systems change agenda that the white paper set out. That means reorienting how central government operates, both the kind of core architecture, but also how central government is going to work with place. And I think there's still a lot to be done in that sphere. Secondly, is to move forward now with the next phase of the devolution agenda. Crucially, that sits within this broader conception of how we see the distribution of power and how that leads to the allocation of resources operating, and that now needs to be taken forward at speed. And then thirdly, and most importantly, and this comes to the core challenge in all of this, how this framework will endure. Ultimately, we're all familiar with the sort of short-termism which has at times plagued the history of this policy area. We need a framework, and the white paper is obviously very explicit about this, that will endure. That is a hugely significant challenge, and there is a series of quite significant institutional reforms that you need to take forward to ensure that you have any fighting chance of that being the case. So I'm sure we'll get into more of these as we go through, but I thought that's where we'd start.
Thanks very much, Josh. That's a really good summary of the ambition, or the different kinds of ambition that are in the white paper. So in many ways, there are lots of criticisms, of course, that have been aired of it, but in many ways it is a landmark document for the reasons you say. Just a couple of follow-up questions on that question about the idea of growth everywhere as an ambition, which is pretty clearly stated there. As you know, and you will have known because of all the papers and debates you will have read, you and your colleagues, there is an alternative view which says actually you need to prioritize, and that if we really are going to go for growth, that's going to ultimately, if you like, trickle down or benefit other lots of places that may not have their own kind of economic engine, or at least that engine is not functioning well, that we should prioritize and have a strategy that focuses on our second tier cities and really make sure that they are performing to the kind of level that other countries' second tier cities are. I'm sure you had a pretty lively internal debate about that. How did you, just give us a sense of how you came to that decision to go for growth everywhere, and without, and I don't mean this crudely, but how much of that was about politics, because it is a response to some of the key political developments of recent years?
Yeah, I'll start there then, which is, I think the way we think about that imperative is there is a moral imperative in all of this. I think irrespective of where you come down on the debate about the economic literature and where you sort of most productive and sort of allocatively efficient growth strategy lies, there is a sort of separate and equally important question about about sort of what a socially just version of this policy looks like. And I think the view that we come to in the white paper, and I think a view that Andy and the Secretary of State were keen on throughout, is that anything that we do in this space has to work for everybody, otherwise it is not a legitimate project in that sense. The whole point about the history in this space has been that it has been that we've had an incredibly lopsided growth model, which has to some extent produced a degree of prosperity, but that it is not acceptable to continue to do that at the cost of all of these places. So in that sense, there is a moral and I think sort of social justice imperative to trying to focus on all places. But on the economics, I think that as you say, that we obviously did have a quite lengthy internal debate about that, and it was also a debate that we had with lots of others in the kind of run up to the white paper, both reading everything that's being written about this, consuming the literature, but also getting out and talking to others. And what we took from that literature was that there is no good correlation between the GDP per capita in, say, OECD countries and lopsided growth models, right? So it's not the case that to achieve very high levels of aggregate growth that you have to have this lopsided growth model. There's a very poor correlation between those things. So in that sense, our reading of that literature was, well, there's no reason at all in the UK's case economically why we can't be unlocking much more growth in some of these places. Now, then you get into the conversation about whether or not it should be cities and focusing on the sort of underperforming second tier of UK cities. And, in some senses, and, obviously you can challenge this on the basis that it's a kind of have your cake and eat it kind of approach. But, the white paper says that we can actually have both if we're willing to make the right investments. The Living Standards mission explicitly calls out the need to have a globally competitive city in every region of the UK. So there is a very clear focus there on improving the UK's second-tier cities and closing that productivity gap with our sort of peer competitors. But that also more broadly, that doesn't need to come at the exclusion of improving the productivity and living standards of the towns and villages that surround these larger economic agglomerations. So, to some extent, those are complementary efforts as well. So lots of people, their revealed preferences, they don't want to live in big busy cities, but we should be able to plug them into different kinds of places where they want to live, and they should be able to then commute and go to work there. And that's a vision that's sort of built into the way that you think about growth in the white paper.
Okay, and just one other follow-up before we move on. On this issue about how do we know, or can we be confident this will endure? That there is a future to this. I mean, if you look even since the white paper was published, politics has moved quite radically, and obviously the cost of living crisis has become a sort of major, potentially enormous obstacle to aspects of this agenda. Certainly in terms of fiscal further resources being released for it. But I'm just interested in this about what is it about the way in which you've set the framework up you think that means that this will in a sense defy the laws of British politics, because as you touched on, we've had lots of different initiatives that have usually lasted a few years and either been scrapped by or quietly forgotten by that government, or indeed scrapped by the one that follows it. What's different about this, do you think, in terms of its longevity?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things going on here. One, on the policy itself, I think what we've tried to consciously do, and obviously time will sort of be the judge on this, is to build a set of institutions that will have a greater chance of enduring into the future. That is sort of the primary motivation behind the missions. The missions give you a long-term outlook around a set of objectives that you want to achieve that can endure over a longer time period. There is an incentive for any successive government to iterate and improve on those missions, but that having the institution of the missions, we think, will become sticky, and it will be more difficult for a future government of any sort of stripe to sort of jettison that system. We're trying to embed that system of thinking about missions and place-based policy in legislation. Governments will have to produce an annual report on how they're progressing against their missions. There will be an obligation for governments to set missions. So that kind of core institution will provide some degree of longevity and long-termism, which hasn't existed before. Crucially, it's also a system which spans across the whole spread of government policy. So again, you're embedding that stickiness across everything that we are doing, and you're making it increasingly difficult for you to sort of jettison one individual part of it. It would be very unusual, and I would think very unlikely in the future, for a future government to turn up and say, I'm not going to have a health mission. I'm just not going to bother with that. I'm going to scrap that bit, and I'm going to have a lot of churn there. And obviously the white paper has a series of other sort of institutions which are either legal or political in nature, which try and embed that long-termism. The second thing is, I think, just we have been storing up this problem in UK political economy for decades now. And I think it's not an accident that this issue has reached where it is in the agenda today. And I think given its confluence with the other structural challenges that we're going to face over the next 20 or 30 years, I think there is a degree of inbuilt longevity, and that there are a set of aligned political and economic incentives now that will make it very difficult to have some sort of endurance and focus on this. It's very difficult for me to now imagine a world where a future government, again, of any description, would not, would have to answer a question about what they're going to do to address spatial inequality in the UK. How does that feature in your growth model? I can't see a confluence of political and economic factors that would now allow that to fall off the agenda in a way that is now front and centre.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Francesca, over to you.
Well, the first thing to say is I take my hat off to Josh and his colleagues, and I'm not going to say too much about the white paper just now because I think we're going to come on and talk about that. But I did just want to acknowledge that. In fact, Mike set us some homework, which was to reflect on our experience of working with place and the relationship to life opportunities. And first of all, I thought, my experience is my lived experience, and we all have that about our places. And certainly I began my working life as a neighbourhood social worker in my hometown of South, and working in South Leeds in the 80s at a time when the traditional industries were facing decline, manufacturing, textile, mining. And I certainly saw how that knocked the stuffing out of the families and communities that I was working with, and similarly families and communities and places across vast swathes of the north. And I suppose that has informed me all my working life, in that I've wanted to try and find the policy solutions and the political circumstances that might facilitate a way of improving life opportunities. And I've been very fortunate in how I've been able to progress that in a way. Roll forward 20 years and I was part of a research team, a government evaluation research team that looked at new council constitutions, which introduced leader cabinets and the first city mayors, and also a member of the Lions Review of Local Government, which looked at how empowered local leaders could try and place shape. And I think I counted up and I visited over 30 local authorities across all places in England. And so I got a very clear sense of the enormous passion and ability of local place-based leaders, and some of their frustrations about the lack of fiscal freedoms and the need to join up. And it gave me certainly a sense that actually the directly elected political leadership model had something that really helped in terms of soft powers to bring together key stakeholders and communities. So I felt very fortunate to be in Greater Manchester, and at the time of a Devo deal being announced. And I was, I think, an early and I hope evidenced advocate for the potential of that model. And obviously Greater Manchester had some advantages. You can play a kind of game of municipal twister in Greater Manchester and have one limb in 4 different boroughs at once. So it had some advantages. But I think what we've seen there is the real potential to put an investment into driving up growth, innovation, skills development, and the associated infrastructures of housing and transport. So that's been a fortunate privilege to be part of that system. And in fact, my role for policy at Manchester involves trying to help connect researchers right across the university with policymakers in Greater Manchester and in the places in Greater Manchester across a whole range of agendas that are absolutely critical to improving life opportunities. And I've also been able to progress my own interest in gender policy and policy making, and joined the Women and Girls panel in Greater Manchester. And I think that's been very important because we need to understand the intersecting inequalities in places. And in Greater Manchester, just as elsewhere, there are some gender-based inequalities about the kind of occupational choices that women end up with, working in low-paid, insecure sectors where they're hugely overrepresented, and being very underrepresented in sectors that we want to see growing if we are to hope to develop local industrial strategies, the sectors, green technologies, digital, advanced manufacturing. And we also see that women drop out of the labour market during the childbearing years. And this leads to consequential poverty over the life cycle. So on the panel, we've been looking at education, skills and employment policies that might facilitate improvement in these intersecting inequalities, because it's important to say the risks of really a lack of life opportunity, and never mind the loss to the labour market of talent and skill, that these risks are not felt evenly. And it is women of colour who face a greater risk of lower employment rates and job insecurity. And women in certain parts of Greater Manchester face much greater pay gaps. So we've been looking at the whole range of levers, both place-based and also national policy levers, to see what can help women and girls in Greater Manchester live their best lives. And unless we might talk some more about that. But so in concluding and reflecting on my experience of place and the link to life opportunities, I think I would say I wholeheartedly endorse a focus and giving freedom to place-based political leaders, because they know what the problem is, they know how to solve it in their areas, and they have the knowledge and connections to get things done. But it's not the only answer, and there are other policy levers that we need to address to improve life opportunities.
Great, thank you very much, Francesca. Can I just pick up on that very last point, actually? I think because it opens up, it sounds like from your experience of working on that panel, you're touching on what is really one of the biggest questions in this whole agenda, which is, to what extent, because obviously, issues of inequality and disadvantage work themselves out in people's lives in places. But actually, is it better and more effective and maybe more legitimate to tackle some of those disadvantages through policy that's place blind, that is in areas like skills or health policy or education? Or is it the case that a place agenda of the kind that Levelling Up is pushing us towards says that we should be much more focused on either tailoring those policies or actually delivering those policies nearer to where the problems manifest? Now, I know that's a really broad question. I'm just interested, but in terms of the panel and the discussions you've had, there must have been lots of dilemmas around that. How do you think we should go about trying to balance those different perspectives?
Well, first of all, I don't think skills should be a place-blind agenda. I absolutely think that should be a place-based agenda, and that's one of the strongest things that came out from our inquiry, is that if you know where the skills gaps are, then you can direct policies, but only if you've got control of the adult education budget, the apprenticeships and the FE budgets, and that without that, it's very hard to actually create effective effective interventions that will support and particularly open up the choices that are made about what to get women into STEM, essentially, and also to support retraining where there's churn. But the other thing is that one of the biggest things that came across in our deliberations is childcare, and I think we might come on to this. I think it's one of the problems in the white paper is a lack of focus on early years, and that that's a national scheme. I'm not suggesting that you should make the funding of childcare place-based. I think there should be national funding for 2, 3 and 4-year-olds should be extended, and that would at a fell swoop provide a huge investment into the life opportunities of young children and meet those educational goals, but also would support this huge pool of talent of women, of parents leaving the labour market because they don't have adequate childcare.
Thank you very much. Fiona, let's move on to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to come at this a little bit of a different way. I mean, as a geographer, as a human geographer, actually, who I've worked in all kinds of contexts, it seems to me that place is just absolutely critical for everyone as a human being. It's about self, it's about identity, it's about belonging, rootedness, it's fundamentally about home. And I think government in many ways sees people as customers or users, doesn't see them as people who live in and occupy a place and who have worked out how to live together. And so it does, to me, seem really fundamental that we need to understand how people feel about place. It's a very qualitative word, but it's really, really important. The second point to make is that actually there's quite a lot of research on this. Most people really like their place. In fact, many people love their place, even when it's full of problems and challenges, even when it frustrates them, even when, frankly, they want to get away from it. There's still a sort of sense of love about place, whether it's where you were born or where you lived. If people who are very mobile still love places that they may have occupied and felt part of their lives. And that's due to the hidden networks, the things you can't see, which policy is not very good at finding out, community relationships and support systems that aren't through any delivery channel, but which make a place work. And it's why actually displacement has often failed historically, because we've failed completely to recognize that those relationships exist. So when you think about how government works classically, and I know this is what the white paper is trying to get away, but it has a brilliant idea and then it rolls it out. That's the, my time in the Cabinet Office is all about rollout of policy, as if everywhere was the same, and manifestly everywhere is not the same. But actually, if we could turn that round so that every place matters, and you start by understanding what is special about every place, what people love, what people are frustrated by, what are the characters and the particularities of place that mean something to people, you would then, I think, be building a very different future, a future that is qualitative as well as quantitative, and which actually has real meaning for people. And for that, you surely do need place-based policy making. And there's very few departments at the moment who think in place terms. There are some, actually, DLUC is one. DEFRA actually thinks in place-based, DCMS a bit, actually, as well. So, I'm not going to say that nobody does. But most of government policy is very centralized, very, sort of rolling it out as if everywhere was the same. So I just wanted very briefly to talk about this exercise I was involved with, Where We Live Now, which was a British Academy exercise we published this in 2017, which seems a long time ago, but just 5 very quick points which we recommended to introduce place-based policymaking. First of all, and this plays back to something you said earlier, Josh, it's about a new definition of progress, not growth, actually. This is really important. And Diana Coyle and I share a kind of, I don't know how we describe our relationship with GDP, but GDP is kind of not a good measure, actually, of progress. And so thinking about progress and productivity, which I know we're coming on to today, and recognizing that in different parts of the country, there are different measures you would use. What looks good in Cornwall is not the same as what looks good in Manchester. So you really need to be much, much more subtle about those ambitions. Secondly, blindingly obvious, it's about integration, not fragmentation, getting away from the silos and joining up. Thirdly, it's about resilience and long-term thinking, actually making sensible investments for the long term, not quick fix solutions. Fourthly, it's about valuing place-based assets, this sense of what makes a place special and building the future around something that already exists, not trying to impose some, exciting new, shiny new model on people. And finally, recognizing that quality of place fundamentally is what gives people that sense of belonging and being part of something bigger. So I want to leave it there with just some thoughts that, we have sort of been here before a bit, but actually we have not succeeded yet in place-based policy. I hope we do now, but it's not a simple task. And I think it fundamentally is about people and how they feel and their relationship with place.
So thank you, Fiona. Let me just follow up on that point. And this links nicely back to the white paper, because again, one of the different ways in which it's unusual and ambitious is that there's quite a clear statement of a commitment to taking seriously how people feel about their place. I think there's this term pride in place is one of your overarching themes, and it's also one of the 12 missions. So, it's integrated, and money is going to flow towards that goal, whatever it means. And I just want to start, Fiona, just by asking you, you obviously agree with the principle that government should take that that kind of softer aspect, I suppose, of place seriously. But how do they do that? What does, given that, as you say, people, a lot of us may feel strongly about the place we live in. How should that be weighed by a government when it's trying to think about what Josh was talking about, a growth model, or it's trying to try to repair broken communities? How can it be confident that it's going to allocate money to the right kind of thing that's going to boost people's feelings?
I think central government shouldn't try to do that, frankly. Right. I think there's a huge issue here, which you touched on, Josh, about devolution. It's more than devolution, actually. It's genuine understanding of what level in the system is the best level to make decisions and to help people be architects of their future. Now, the planning system in its place has some experience of that with neighborhood planning and some of those place making techniques. So we're not starting from nothing, but they are very narrowly confined when you think about some of the big ambitions that the white paper has. So I think this is about government letting go, actually, and having the confidence to let go and allow others to make decisions and to make choices about investments. But I do think if we're just chasing growth, I am worried about that, because I think growth is an illusion. We can't, for environmental reasons, sustain how we currently characterize growth in GDP terms in perpetuity. We need to think about progress and about quality of life and quality of experience for people. And I think that would send different signals and different investment choices around sustainability and a much more collaborative feel. So I think it's a big challenge to the framework that's been set out.
Okay, so let me follow up with a question that is going to be, I'm going to put to you all, but it comes out of what you've just said. So devolution, which you've touched on and Francesca talked about, and is there's an ambitious framework in the white paper. So, let's start with the particular model that is advocated. The framework in the white paper talks about essentially building on what's there already. So Andy Burnham might get some more powers if the negotiation goes well. You build on the existing model of elected mayors. You may create some more combined authorities. And then there are these county mayors, which is an interesting and pretty novel construction in the English system. Fiona, what's your take on that particular model? I'm particularly interested in you're someone interested in rural places as well. Do you think county-wide governance is going to work?
I think that, the trouble is it's messy in this country. We don't have county-wide governance everywhere. We've got some combined authorities, we've got some district councils, we've got some county councils. We do not have an easy system to make those decisions. And of course, some decisions, do need to be made for subsidiarity reasons at different levels. Some genuinely, there's some national priorities and some national principles. Then there are, more localized decisions. And in fact, with one of my many other hats on, I'm grappling in Cambridgeshire with a conundrum of, how to find the right place to do the right thing environmentally. We've got so many competing priorities, and actually what is the spatial sensible framework where you can start to say, well, you know, plant trees there and do this there. At the moment, it's very confusing and difficult. And actually, the county level is quite a good level. Big counties are quite a manageable. They're conceptually attractive to people because people know if they're from Yorkshire or Gloucestershire or wherever. Whereas actually, if you start talking, I don't know if they're from Manchester, of course. So to some extent, you know, you have to use levels of governance that make sense to people and that they can connect with. And in some issues, it's going to be much, much more local than that, the detailed decision making. So we don't start with an easy, fortunately, that's not my problem, it's yours.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point, but also I mean, in lots of places in England, that functional point you're making about thinking functionally, where would this policy be best delivered, does not sit easily with the, if you like, the place identity, you know, the level of the geography with which people connect. And that's a major problem, isn't it, here? Josh, in terms of, I mean, obviously, you know, you were part of the thinking behind the framework, and I suppose we can't ask too much about the negotiations that are going on right now. What do you think English devolution looks like in a few years' time, in 5 years' time?
Well, hopefully we'll be making significant progress towards the ambition stated in the mission, which is that, you know, if you are an area of whatever sort of geography, and I think the point about the county deal model is that it opens up and sort of more democratizes the access to that institution of local governance. If you are a local area and it is the sort of democratic will of the people who live there that they would like more powers, then they will either have those powers or they will be on their way to having them agreed. And I think that really is the innovation that comes through the county deals model, because to exactly as we've been saying throughout already this morning, it's about going to people where they feel they belong to a sense of place. And actually it speaks to a broader, you know, you asked right at the beginning, Mike, about things that we thought we were doing differently through the white paper compared to what we were doing before. I think one of those innovations is that we are trying to rationalize what might be the sort of theoretically, economically most optimal thing with people's sense of place, a cultural and political identity, and to try and rationalize those things. And I think county deals is in essence an attempt to try and do that, to give people agency over decisions about public services and about growth and living standards in their area, whilst rationalizing that with a sense of where they belong and where they live. You know, in theory, it might be optimal to divide the country up into travel to work areas and to, you know, give everybody a directly elected assembly in your travel to work area, but we know that's not true. And I think that's the model that we are shifting towards, is one that makes sense both from an economic and a political and cultural geography. And, you know, more broadly, that is built into the framework in the heart of the white paper. You know, as we've been saying, the sense of place and people's pride in their sense of place should be reflected in their local governance arrangements. And I think that's what we'd like to see, is people, you know, at a basic level, knowing who their directly elected mayor is more frequently, knowing how decisions that affect them are being made. So it's not just, you know, to your question about what we'd like to see, it's not just I'd like to see progress in devolution negotiations, obviously we would, but also we want to see progress in terms of how people conceptualize they are being governed. And in that sense, you know, we'd like to see people, you know, if you ask them, if you go out in 5 years' time and poll people in County Durham, I'd like, you know, for them to respond with, well, you know, I think I'm governed from Westminster, but also I'm governed locally from County Durham, and it's not just a local authority that takes out the bins, it's a local authority which is making decisions that affect me, and I feel I have agency in that.
So one of the challenges here is clearly about whether, if you have that model, whether you've got the sort of capability and, you know, capacity, be it things like data, be it sort of, you know, people who understand policy, but as well as, you know, good leaders and capable leaders. You obviously mentioned Manchester, which in a way is the poster child, I think, for this sort of model in some ways. I know there've been spats between the government and Andy Burnham, but in some ways, you know, many ways actually, Manchester is presented as the most sort of optimal example of the devolution model we've got, this very half-built model. But can we be sure? Are you confident that if Josh gets his way and this model starts to roll out, that we'll have the same kind of quality of leadership and governance and of really capable leaders in different parts of the country?
Well, I think that's not a difficult thing to ensure and support, is it? Really, it's not beyond the wit of our systems to enable learning and to support the development of capacity and capability where it's needed. And on this question of the future of devolution, I was asked this at the select committee on the progress of devolution just before lockdown. And I remember struggling with it then and thinking, but actually all parts of the country, rural and coastal areas, have issues with transport, with housing provision, with skills development, with the need for innovation and to support the development of new jobs, even if they look different and they're in different types of industry. That those problems exist everywhere, and they're not problems that can be solved without some kind of joining up. And I think the masterly trick of the no, I don't say trick because that sounds somehow sleight of hand, but I think that the really sensible thing the white paper has done has been to set out a framework and to offer carrots and not sticks, because these are tricky decisions that people have to make, as you're describing here. They are, and I know in parts of the country that are very concerned about a loss of local autonomy, which I'll come on to that. So you need to give people, local political leaders, the parties and the public, the information so they can look at the costs of making changes that they're perhaps a little bit uncomfortable with. But I don't think that a path of greater devolution should undermine local autonomy. I mean, if you asked any of the 10 leaders in Greater Manchester about their local autonomy, they would fiercely seize it and be very aware of their own places, and within their places, the different life opportunities within their places. So we've just got to be a little bit more politically courageous and seize this opportunity. But I would say that, are we going to talk about the protective, whether these reforms could disappear? Are you going to come on to that, or shall I say something now on
Say
that?
something very quickly now, yeah.
Very quickly, I think that the directly elected leadership role is the thing that will keep this show on the road, because once you create the chance for people to have a vote, I don't think you can take it away. And I think I think the changes in Whitehall are really essential and important, but I actually think that transfer of political legitimacy to a directly elected leader is the protective element.
Okay, so we're getting towards the point where I'm going to put some questions from the audience here and at home. I'm just going to put one more question to the panel. It's a very broad question, but try and be brief, which is indicative. Because I just want to come back to, we haven't talked so much about the opportunities side of the question we have in front of us. And I just want to sort of hone in on what is a very particular sort of wicked problem, if you like, here, or maybe not, I don't know, it depends how you look at it, which is about the fact that for many people in left behind areas, let's use that shorthand, however to define it, for many people, the only chance to get on and improve your life chances is to get out of the place you inhabit. Now, to what extent is that a problem that government should care deeply about and do something about? Because I mean, there's if you like, it touches on your, we'll start with you, Fiona, your point about people, we need to understand how people are of their place and attached to their place. Well, that may be so, but many people just have to get out, or indeed go to university, which is the main mechanism for getting out, not the only one. Is that a problem in terms of the sort of policy towards those places?
If you look at me, I don't think we should ever try to dictate, where and how people live. I think we should just make each place as livable and as attractive as it can be. I mean, the whole question about needing to get out is about social mobility. And actually, I would just agree with Francesca that, early years, I mean, never mind university, early years is the key. That's where the big disparities set in from a very, very early stage. So, I mean, I think there are all kinds of things the government could do that would help. But I do want to make the rural point as well, because there's a slight assumption, I mean, I may be wrong in the white paper, that, you know, rural areas are where people kind of commute from or go and live for lifestyle reasons. But actually, rural areas really need people to live and work there, to do all the jobs we want from our new environmental policies of land management. And actually, they can't afford the housing. They can't afford, you know, there's no transport at all. There's very little social infrastructure. And what there is provided voluntarily, not by the system. And actually, it does feel as if the white paper's weak on that kind of intra-regional perspective. And the rural organizations feel a little bit anxious that they are just the left behinds, if you like, because they're just invisible. So I think, you know, I've already made my kind of big challenge on the environment, which I do, and there isn't an environmental capital, which I was personally really, really surprised by. And so I think this whole sense of how sustainable this is, so people will live where they will choose to live if they have opportunity. And I think that's where, rather than trying to sort of feel it's about people climbing out of somewhere, just recognize every place should be able to provide a mix of opportunities for people.
So my sense is, Josh, that the government in general, I mean, I don't know about the task force in particular, but does think that this is a problem and is keen to develop a sort of alternative offer, as it were, for some of those places, be it further education colleges or be it, you know, some of the commitments in the white paper to improving the sort of infrastructure of places and so on. Is that your sense? Is that how that played out? Was that a big issue in your
absolutely, and it takes us right back to where we've started in some sense. It's about making normative choices about which places matter more than others. And I think in the white paper we are actually trying to signal that all of those places do matter. You know, I grew up in one of those rural areas in you know, Northumberland, and it faces exactly those challenges where it was increasing. You know, the village I grew up in was increasingly a place people went to go and retire. They were not working there. Families were being driven out. Housing was not being provided. So even though it was a small village, it was getting more expensive. The bus came once every 2 hours. But that is the shift that we're trying to achieve through giving those areas more agency in how they make their own decisions. You know, the decision about how frequent the bus was coming and what level the subsidy was being set at when I was growing up there was made in the Department for Transport down the road. You know, that is obviously not sustainable, and the new governance arrangements that already exist in Northumberland have already made progress in starting to address that. Not least because it means that when you have local governance, obviously you can take a more holistic view as to what the area, what the needs of that local area are. So connectivity is improving now, housing growth has increased, and you're starting to see some progress there. And I think there is a credible commitment to doing that. I mean, take the Levelling Up Fund as just one example of it. You know, that fund is very much focusing on addressing often very hyper-local infrastructure needs in places of all descriptions, right? So, you know, there is no reason at all why the local government responsible for a small rural area could not bid for, and indeed have bid for, projects that will address very specific hyper-local needs that we in central government, you know, have no sight of, and as you say, we would agree we're not best placed to be making those decisions, but we are putting in place funding streams that will allow people to better tailor to those outcomes. So I think you're right, Mike. There is a concerted effort to try and make policy more sensitive to those needs through the institutions, not through central government doing it all.
Francesca, do you want to add anything on that point particularly?
Only that I thought that phrase in the white paper, go far and stay local, really encapsulated something that people feel about their places. And that, you know, I was partly motivated to encourage the growth of a vibrant north, partly because I didn't want to lose my daughter to London, which I have, and I hope she'll come back at some time.
We'll tell her.
But in all, the serious point is, you know, universities and higher level skills development, it is absolutely crucial in all areas.
Okay, there's lots more issues we could cover, and I know we haven't all the points I know you've both got about the white paper. You can talk privately to Josh about afterwards, but and there are other policy issues besides in all of this that we haven't got into, but maybe they'll come through the questions. So have we got the roving mics around? Somebody ready? Yep. So if you just put your hands up, if I don't recognize you, don't be offended. The lights are very bright. So I'm just going to go to the woman there at the back. So straight towards the back. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, start there, and then we'll go to the person behind. So sorry, can you just say who you are and where you're from?
My name is Jen O'Hara. I'm from Eastbourne. So one of those very sticky, difficult local authority places that none of this naturally fits in. But my concern and my interest is in, Josh, what you're saying in referring to growth. And if there is capacity within what you're developing for a redefinition of growth in terms of net zero and the circular economy, and actually, as Dame Fiona was saying, thinking more in terms of progress and quality of experience rather than growth.
Thank you. And then, yeah, the person behind.
Thank you. I'm Beena Agarwal. And thank you for all the interventions. All the panelists in some way or other have focused on the importance of local community, rootedness, culture as enriching. So you would want people to stay in their own place. And now suppose there's a counter argument. Raj Chetty at Harvard had created this atlas for the US, which showed that physical mobility makes a huge difference to increasing life's opportunities for education, for earnings, even for marriage opportunities. So that argument would be that you would need to, as you said, get out. And it seems to me, which argument you take depends on where you're born. So if you're born in a rich family, in a rich neighborhood, it's fine to stay there. But if you're not, then clearly there has to be public policy which enables people to look for other opportunities. And this would not be just within a country, but cross-country, which is why so many people from the global south look for opportunities elsewhere. So it seems to me it would be very narrow for us to say, well, we can all bring every opportunity to the place where somebody is born, because clearly that's not realistic. So my question is, has such a mapping been done for the UK, as Raj Chetty did for the US, on the link between place and people's life opportunities? And if you did do that, how would you reframe public policy if your findings were similar to his?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one more question on this side of the room, so I can see, was it Chris had his hand up, Chris Wormold. I will come to that side of the room in a bit, so you'll get your time. So and then I'll put one question to each of you.
Yeah, thanks. Chris Wormold, Permanent Secretary of Department of Health and Social Care. First thing I wanted to say, brilliant panel and fantastic insights. I've previously been responsible for some of this under Gordon Brown's spatial policy, and just looking at how the thinking has moved on, it's wonderful to see. My question, so I've been in Whitehall for 30 years, yet to work for a government that didn't want some form of decentralization or devolution, and it largely hasn't happened. So the question is the why it hasn't happened. And just to specify a bit more, I think there's a sort of what question and a where question. So where, and I'll take my own responsibilities, in health, what is a place? We went down the road to Addenbrooke's, it would have a local role, a regional role, a national role, and an international role. And the challenge is, what does that place actually mean in health? And the chief medical officer would observe that health profile of Blackpool is much closer to that of Eastbourne than it is to Manchester. So what's its place? And I think it's a really interesting set of questions there. And then the what, I think one of the things we've been really bad at is what are the types of policy that you should do at which spatial level? So I'll take some recent examples for me. In the pandemic, possibly our most criticised program, Test and Trace, pretty much, often wrongly criticised, but most people think was too national, not enough local, and of course it moved much more local as it went through. Our most praised policy, vaccines, could not have been more national.
Yeah.
No. Central
Yeah.
procurement,
Yeah.
all the lawyers contracted to me, etc., couldn't have been more national. Now, there's clearly truth in both those arguments. And I think that's one of the, and I'll be really interested in the panel's reflections on what are the nature of policy where, local really is better, and which are the ones where actually the characteristics mean do it once, do it well is better. But as I say, absolutely fantastic panel and really great debate.
Thank you, Chris. A really great question. So let's take those three questions. I'm not going to ask each of you to answer all three for time reasons. So if you want to indicate really who would most like to have a go, or I can have a guess maybe. On the first question about should we be redefining growth, I suspect everyone's going to say yes.
Well, I want to know what Josh thinks
Yeah.
on that one.
Well, maybe we'll start with Josh then. You think you're redefining growth as well? Then?
We do. You're absolutely right that when we say growth, we don't mean just GDP.
Good.
And I think that is
Excellent.
really important.
Excellent.
And I hope that is clearly expressed in the missions. The missions give you 12, often quite different social and economic and political outcomes that we want to achieve, trying to represent what, the plurality definition of what progress might look like. So I actually think that we have explicitly tried to sort of bake all that in, and it is obviously not just about GDP figures. It also comes through in how the kind of methodological plumbing of what we've done is set out. The capitals framework that sits right in the middle of all of it, which to the astute amongst you will notice heavily inspired by Diane's work and all the work that Bennett has been doing, no surprises there, is a capitals framework that explicitly acknowledges this plurality of what the good looks like, and that you need all of these things together to achieve better aggregate outcomes. So, we've talked about pride and place and the way that features. That's not just an ancillary or separate concern. That capitals framework says that is important not only because it improves life satisfaction or people have a stronger sense of place and identity, but also feeds through into your growth metrics as well. We know from the literature that that those kind of stronger senses of local identity and community embody trust, and trust is critical to building the economic networks that enable growth. Right. So the whole point about that framework is to say that all of these things are interlinked, are interconnected, and that you can't just think about this in a kind of relatively narrow way. So it is hopefully a more inclusive and more holistic conception of both what growth and progress looks like, but also how you achieve it. Specifically on the questions about sort of sustainability, I think it is true that there is lots of discussion in the white paper about the interaction with net zero. There is a sort of bureaucratic point here, which is that we were also contemporaneously publishing a net zero strategy around the same time, and there was just sort of division of responsibility in some senses. You'd be sort of hopefully pleased to hear that, unlike some Whitehall processes, we were very closely connected with that process, and those bits of work were drafted together. We worked very closely with the team in the business department who were leading that, and that in itself was a kind of cross Whitehall initiative. And as the white paper acknowledges, these objectives are complementary. There is not a vision here of long-term growth and progress in the UK that doesn't involve us meeting our net zero targets and shifting towards an economy which is more sustainable. Indeed, many of the opportunities in this space lie in the intersection between those two things. Very much the kind of industrial strategy vision that we have for many places, and where their natural strength may lie, is from transitioning previously deindustrializing economies into places that will be at the frontier of the net zero transition. And again, because I come from there, I'm going to highlight these. We're already seeing this happen. This huge gigafactory investment by British Volt in Blythe, just down the road from where I grew up. That was previously, and is still suffering the long tail of the effects of deindustrialization, but is now starting to see the green shoots of what more sustainable and durable growth and progress in that part of the world will look like. And that, as you said, is not something that we can just capture in GDP, and we're certainly not sort of seeking to do that.
Okay. Then the second question, which was about the sort of mapping of place in relation to life chances, and some skepticism about the idea that government can credibly invest in all places in order to sort of reflect people's sentiments about place. I mean, just I don't know about the empirical question there, whether anyone's done a Raj Chetty type exercise. Diane will know. No, and actually, it's something we've talked about the need for it in the UK. I mean, in the UK, that there is, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is lots of data on different key social outcome indicators. What we haven't got is that sort of integrated analysis which he provides. But I think there's a point behind this about how should we, a bigger question here, which is what I was trying to get at with my question, how should we think about a policy agenda around life chances and places? You know, at what level is it? How should we set public expectations there about what government, central or local, is really going to be able to do for many places and for people within them? Didn't want to have a go at that.
Well, I still come back to my point that we cannot tell people where to live or not to move, or, you know, I just think that that would be kind of social engineering of a kind that, you know, would not be acceptable. But I do think if we have real pride in our landscape, and I mean, I take in this broadest possible sense, you know, the community and the country and the sort of sense of diversity, and we have policies that are sufficiently smart to bring out the best in every place, whether it's a little village or a big city, or whether it's, you know, rural Lincolnshire or wherever, you know, I think we then stand a chance of people, and then we provide the opportunity for people through, and I early years education right through to you know, higher education is all part of a big continuum. We've broken those links. I mean, when I was in the Cabinet Office, it was all about Sure Start. That was one of the best things any government has ever done for early years, and it's pretty much all gone now. And I think, you know, if we really mean this, we've got to make every place function sustainably, successfully, culturally, economically. You know, that's what we should be going for. And actually, just I must just come in and kind of, what is a place in health? If we could really get the integration of social care and local health, you would then that would begin to answer that question, because those services really knitted together. I know it's a huge question, a huge challenge, because of course there are you know, centres of excellence and certain functions you can only provide at a certain level, but the basic preventive health, not well-being, actually, to pick up the other good ambition of the white paper, is about making sure that people have the chances to live healthy lives. And the integration of health and social care, which is not yet complete, is one of those things that would help define place in that sense.
Well, talking about the integration of health and social care does bring us back to Manchester quite neatly. And I mean, do you want to have a reflection as well, not just on that, but on Chris's question about, you know, I suppose on devolution more generally, because I mean, I think it is, I completely recognise what you say, that we have got a history, a very recognisable history now of promising success, particularly actually politicians in opposition, promising to devolve when they get into power. And it very rarely happens, or happens in only a sort of very incomplete way. Is there something there about the British system that needs to be rewired?
Well, okay, Mike, well, that's two big questions.
Two big, yeah. And you've got to be brief as well.
Right. Isn't it always said, if we were designing a policy, we wouldn't start from here? And obviously we wouldn't start designing a system where local government has so little ability to determine its own future. But that's not where we are. We have to start from where we are. And, you know, I hope that this, that the Levelling Up white paper devolution framework will provide some robust defence against the kind of things that have happened to previous big national rollouts, like Next Steps agencies in government. As I say, and I have said, I think the directly elected political leadership model is protective there, and that, you know, that we've seen that with Scottish and Welsh devolution. That won't, if you give people a vote, then they have a stake in what's in the political infrastructure. If I can just come on to the problem of place and defining place, I got worried about that when I was designing my comments, because I'm not a political geographer, and but I am sure that there are as many issues around place as there are around the words like community and family, and that they have an emotional appeal and disguise a multitude of contradictions and difficulties. And I absolutely agree that some things are, we need to be smart and use data to work out where we can target policies through places, and where you should just do, I completely agree, Sure Start was the most amazing intervention to improve life opportunities for children, parents and communities, and it's a tragedy that it's gone. And likewise, I would say social care is absolutely critical to get right. It's not all about productivity, because what matters most in that social care relationship is time, is the time that carers spend with the people they're caring for. And there are ways of raising productivity, but we need to value time. And that's not, that is a national funding framework decision.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. So we're running short of time. So I'm going to put 3 questions quickly to you from our online audience. Then I'm going to see if I've got time to get a couple of people on this side of the room who I've discriminated against so far. So I'll try, but you've got to be really brief. You've got to promise me. So we have some great questions coming in online. Again, sorry, we can't have them all represented. One from Ray Shostak, who's an affiliate of ours. Putting aside the horizontal challenges of reordering central government we've talked about, what are the particular challenges and future roles of local government in relation to this agenda? Second question, which from Nandita Das, can we learn best practice on levelling up from other countries? I know there was a bit of thinking about that in the white paper. And then finally from Shan Morgan, who's former permanent secretary of the Welsh government. Excuse me, how do speakers see the levelling up agenda best interacting with and benefiting the devolved nation? Excuse me. So let's take those in order. Local government. Francesca, do you want to do that one?
Yes, I mean, and I really welcome in the white paper this recognition that places are different, and that there are different needs of coastal communities, rural areas, county areas, and the city regions. And yeah, I think it's going to be imperative. I would like to see the progression of the devolution framework, but it's also going to be imperative to see targeted funding for particular areas facing their own particular challenges, and also to develop ways of having greater fiscal freedoms for local government in general. I mean, these are problematic to think about at the moment, especially if you're thinking about business rates or charging for waste disposal is very unpopular at the moment, but to think about ways in which local government can gain more autonomy over its ability to raise income.
I do agree that the question of local government in all of this is incredibly important. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to give it its due. It's due here, but we should mark that. International comparators. I'm just going to put that to Josh, because I know you thought long and hard about this on the task force.
The short answer is yes, a huge amount, and we very much try to do that. There are examples that everybody is familiar with, and I think I've now read basically everything that's ever been written about East Germany.
Yeah.
If you want to know what I think about it, it's varied at best. But anyhow, but beyond that, I think there's actually a lot to be learned from some of the slightly less popular examples. So we actually learned a lot from what's going on in some deindustrialized American cities. I think you can learn a lot from what's happening in Pittsburgh and San Antonio, and you might have written a bit about this as well, and we took great inspiration from pieces like that in trying to learn what they were doing. It's difficult because the political and economic geography of these places are different. It's very difficult to just lift and shift things that you see in other places, but undoubtedly you can learn a huge amount from what's going on, not least because this is not a problem which is unique to the UK. We are particularly challenged in a number of different dimensions, but spatial inequality is a thing that most advanced economies are really grappling with.
And devolution generally, so in terms of how does the levelling up white paper land on top of the system we've already got, devolution? I mean, any thoughts?
It's probably more for Josh, that one. Yeah.
The question of, is this about England or is this run the world?
It is very deliberately a project for the whole of the UK, and it has to be. You know, there is no England-only vision of a more prosperous, wealthier, happier, you know, United Kingdom that is just about England. That's why the missions are UK-wide missions. You know, they cover the whole of the United Kingdom. The goal here is to not just coordinate policy making at the different tiers in England, but to coordinate it better across all of the 4 nations. And you know, there have new structures been put in place in the last couple of years, sort of interministerial level, to try and put the plumbing in place to allow it to happen a little bit better. So, you know, I think in short, the short answer is yes, it's fundamentally a UK-wide project and has to be. And, you know, there is a real, I think, political commitment to working with the devolves in how we achieve this ambition across the piece. And indeed, you know, the early discussions that we've had since the white paper has been published, and indeed before it, have been quite positive, because I think there is a shared sense that there is work to be done here, and that you can, and that it has to be a shared endeavour.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have come to the point where I've run over time by 5 minutes, which I did because Dennis took 5 minutes off. But I think the organising committee of the conference will kill me if I go any further. I'm really sorry, because I know a number of people over there wanted to speak. What I'm going to suggest to the person who chairs the next session is that they start with this side of the room. But anyway, look, it's a really good sign that it sparks such interest. It's such an interesting discussion we've had. I'm really, you know, it's been very wide ranging, and I think we've kicked around some of these pretty big and difficult questions about place and what it means, and how, both I think in operational terms, but also more generally. And obviously we've talked a bit about the white paper, which is a key point of reference. So I want to finish by really thanking our panelists for a really interesting, wide-ranging discussion. Thank you very much.